The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Grand Pavilion at the Westwood Film Festival, casting long golden rectangles across the polished hardwood floor. Outside, a crowd of fans and photographers pressed against the velvet ropes, hoping to catch a glimpse of Hollywood royalty. Inside, event staff scurried about, adjusting microphones and checking lighting one final time before the press conference began. Clint Eastwood arrived through a side entrance, deliberately avoiding the chaos of the red carpet. At his age, he had earned the right to skip certain formalities. He moved with the deliberate gait of someone who had nothing to prove and nowhere to rush to. His weathered face, etched with decades of experience both in front of and behind the camera, remained impassive as he nodded to familiar faces in the crew. "Mr. Eastwood, we're ready whenever you are," a young production assistant whispered, leading him toward the stage where a simple table with water bottles and microphones awaited. Clint adjusted his navy blazer and took his seat, flanked by two producers and the lead actress from his latest film. The movie, a nuanced drama about reconciliation between a father and daughter across political divides, had already generated significant buzz at the festival. Critics were calling it his most timely work in years. In the audience, nearly 100 journalists settled into their seats, notepads and recording devices at the ready. Among them sat Peter Walsh, a man whose reputation preceded him in most rooms he entered. Walsh had built his career writing sharp-tongued political columns for the Progressive Voice, a publication that prided itself on challenging conventional thinking. Recently, he had transitioned to entertainment reporting, bringing with him the same confrontational style that had made his political pieces so divisive yet widely read. "I hear Walsh is here," whispered a veteran entertainment reporter to her colleague. "This should be interesting," her colleague rolled his eyes. "Great." Another film press conference hijacked for political theater. The festival moderator, a respected film critic with salt and pepper hair and round tortoiseshell glasses, approached the center microphone. The room quieted immediately. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be an enlightening discussion about one of the most thought-provoking films at this year's festival. We're honored to have the legendary Clint Eastwood with us today to talk about Divided We Stand." Polite applause filled the room. Eastwood nodded in acknowledgement, a slight smile lifting the corner of his mouth. The moderator continued, "We'll begin with a few remarks from Mr. Eastwood about the film, followed by questions from the press. Please keep your questions focused on the film and the creative process behind it." This last comment seemed pointed, though no names were mentioned. Several journalists exchanged knowing glances. Clint leaned forward to the microphone. His voice, though softer than in his prime, still carried the distinctive gravelly quality that had become his trademark. "First off, I want to thank everyone for coming out today. This film means a lot to me, probably more than anything I've done in the past decade. It's not about politics, though some might see it that way. It's about people. How we've forgotten how to listen to each other." He paused, taking a sip of water. "When I read this script, what struck me wasn't the political backdrop, but the human story at its core. A father and daughter who love each other but can't seem to find common ground. That's something I think we all can relate to these days, regardless of where we fall on the political spectrum." In the third row, Peter Walsh shifted in his seat, jotting notes with a furrowed brow. Unlike most journalists who typed frantically on laptops or phones, Walsh preferred an old-fashioned notebook and pen. He had developed a reputation for memorizing quotes verbatim, often using them out of context to support whatever narrative he was constructing. The lead actress spoke next, discussing her character's journey and the challenge of portraying someone whose political views differed significantly from her own. The producers touched on the difficulty of finding financial backing for a film that refused to demonize either side of the political divide. Throughout these opening remarks, Clint mostly listened, nodding occasionally. Those who knew him well recognized this as his natural state. He had always been more comfortable observing than being the center of attention, despite his decades in the spotlight. When the moderator finally opened the floor for questions, hands shot up across the room. The first several questions followed predictable patterns: inspiration for the project, challenges during filming, what Eastwood hoped audiences would take away from the story. Clint answered each thoughtfully but briefly. He had never been one for long-winded explanations, preferring to let his work speak for itself. When discussing his directorial choices, he emphasized simplicity and authenticity. "I don't believe in manipulating the audience with fancy camera tricks or heavy-handed scoring," he explained. "Life doesn't come with background music telling you how to feel. I try to present situations as honestly as possible and trust viewers to form their own opinions." This philosophy, both in filmmaking and life, had defined Eastwood's career. It had also made him something of an outlier in Hollywood, especially in recent years as the industry became increasingly vocal about political and social issues. Peter Walsh's hand had been up since the first call for questions, but the moderator seemed to be deliberately avoiding him. Finally, after about 15 minutes, perhaps feeling pressure to appear impartial, the moderator reluctantly nodded in Walsh's direction. "Peter Walsh, the progressive voice," he announced, standing as he spoke. Unlike the other journalists who asked their questions and quickly sat down, Walsh remained standing, command of the room. The atmosphere shifted subtly. Several journalists who had been casually taking notes now looked up, sensing a change in the air. The publicist standing at the side of the room straightened, already looking concerned. "Mr. Eastwood," Walsh began, his voice carrying a practiced smoothness that barely concealed the edge underneath. "Your film portrays what you call both sides of the political divide as equally valid and worthy of respect." He paused for effect, looking around the room before continuing. "Given the current climate in America, where one political movement has embraced extremism, conspiracy theories, and policies that actively harm marginalized communities, do you worry that this both sides narrative contributes to false equivalence and ultimately enables harmful ideologies to thrive under the guise of reasonable discourse?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't really a question about the film at all, but a thinly veiled critique of Eastwood's known political leanings. Several journalists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The festival moderator moved toward his microphone, seemingly ready to redirect, but Eastwood held up a hand, signaling he would answer. The room fell silent, all eyes on the legendary filmmaker. At 90-something, Clint Eastwood had witnessed decades of American history. From World War II through the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, the Cold War, and everything that followed. He had seen cultural and political pendulums swing back and forth throughout his lifetime. Now, everyone waited to see how he would respond to this obvious provocation. The lead actress glanced at Eastwood with a mixture of concern and curiosity. The publicist had taken several steps forward, ready to intervene if necessary. But those who had worked with Eastwood before knew he had never been one to shy away from direct questions, regardless of how loaded they might be. Peter Walsh remained standing, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Whatever happened next, he knew it would make headlines, which was precisely what he wanted. The confrontation that had been brewing since the start of the press conference was about to begin. The silence stretched for several uncomfortable seconds. Before Clint could respond, Peter Walsh continued, his voice growing louder. "Let me be more specific, Mr. Eastwood," he said, pulling a small notebook from his jacket pocket and flipping through it with theatrical flair. "You've been quoted saying you believe in personal responsibility and smaller government. Yet your new film portrays a father whose traditional views are given equal moral weight to his daughter's progressive stance." Several journalists exchanged glances. This was rapidly veering away from a film discussion and into the territory of a political ambush. In a time when basic rights are under attack, Walsh pressed on, his voice taking on a mocking edge. "Don't you think it's a bit quaint to pretend both viewpoints deserve equal respect?" The publicist took another step forward, but Eastwood gave a subtle shake of his head. The room grew even more still. Walsh wasn't finished. "Or perhaps at your age, it's difficult to understand how the world has changed." The question landed with deliberate cruelty, drawing a few gasps from the crowd. The moderator finally intervened. "I think we should keep questions focused on—" "No, it's all right," Eastwood said quietly, his weathered voice somehow commanding more attention than Walsh's theatrical performance. "The young man has more to say. Let him finish." This calm response seemed to throw Walsh momentarily, but he quickly recovered. "Well, since you insist," he said with a smirk. "Your generation's ideas about hearing both sides sound noble, but they ignore power imbalances. When one side actively works to strip rights away from vulnerable people, doesn't your listen to everyone approach just enable harm?" He gestured broadly to the room. Everyone here is too polite to say it, but I'll ask directly. How can you justify making a film that treats regressive viewpoints as merely one side of a reasonable debate? The lead actress beside Eastwood shifted uncomfortably. One of the producers leaned forward as if to intervene, but Walsh barreled on. And while we're being honest, he continued, his voice dripping with condescension, let's talk about that empty chair routine from years ago. People laughed, Mr. Eastwood, and not with you. Yet here you are, still presenting yourself as someone whose political insights deserve respect rather than ridicule. A mixture of reactions rippled through the audience. Some journalists looked uncomfortable. Others seemed secretly pleased to witness the confrontation, and a few appeared genuinely angry at Walsh's approach. The festival moderator stepped forward again. That's enough. This press conference is about the film, not, isn't it all connected? Walsh interrupted, refusing to relinquish control of the room. The stories we tell shape our culture. When someone with Mr. Eastwood's influence creates a film suggesting that harmful ideologies deserve a fair hearing, that has real consequences. He turned back to Eastwood, who had remained impressively still throughout the tirade. Some might call your approach balanced. I call it moral cowardice dressed up as wisdom. The publicist was now openly signaling to security near the door, but Eastwood held up his hand again, stopping her. Walsh seemed to take this as an invitation to continue. Your generation loves to talk about civility, Mr. Eastwood, but sometimes civility is just a shield for the privileged. Sometimes wrong ideas need to be called wrong. Forcefully, publicly. He pulled out his phone, holding it up. I've compiled a list of quotes from your past interviews that demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of today's political realities. Would you like me to read them? Without waiting for permission, he began reciting selected fragments from various interviews Eastwood had given over the years, each one stripped of context and presented in the worst possible light. The exercise was clearly designed to provoke an angry response, to get the legendary filmmaker to lose his cool on camera. Throughout this performance, Eastwood remained still, his expression unreadable. Those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, but he gave no other outward sign of frustration or anger. The lead actress beside him, however, was less restrained. This is completely inappropriate, she interjected. We're here to discuss a film that actually addresses the very division you're creating right now. Walsh barely acknowledged her, his focus laser-fixed on Eastwood. Your silence is telling, Mr. Eastwood. Perhaps you recognize the truth in what I'm saying. A veteran entertainment reporter in the front row finally spoke up. Some of us are actually here to discuss cinema, Peter. If you want to host a political debate, maybe do it on your own time. I'm addressing the political implications of this film, Walsh countered smoothly, which are impossible to separate from its creator's worldview. He turned back to Eastwood with a challenging smile. Unless you'd prefer not to defend your views. I understand they don't hold up well under scrutiny these days. The room had transformed from a standard press conference into something more akin to a courtroom, with Walsh playing both prosecutor and judge. Many journalists, even those who might have agreed with some of Walsh's political positions, appeared uncomfortable with his approach. This wasn't journalism as much as it was a personal attack disguised as cultural criticism. The way I see it, Walsh continued, pacing slightly now, seemingly energized by the tension in the room, artists have a responsibility in times like these. Neutrality benefits oppressors, as they say. Your film's both sides approach feels like a relic from a time when we had the luxury of polite disagreement. He paused for effect, then delivered what he clearly believed would be his knockout blow. The world has moved beyond your John Wayne version of America. Mr. Eastwood, your film, like your politics, is a museum piece, interesting perhaps as history, but dangerously out of touch with today's reality. The festival moderator stepped forward yet again, this time with more authority. This press conference will conclude if the next question isn't about the filmmaking itself. Walsh spread his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. I'm discussing the film's central theme. Mr. Eastwood himself said it's about people who can't seem to find common ground. I'm simply pointing out that some ground isn't worth finding. He fixed his gaze directly on Eastwood. So my actual question is this. At what point does your commitment to hearing both sides become complicity with harmful ideologies? Or are you so insulated by privilege that you've never had to consider that question? The room fell completely silent. Several journalists had stopped taking notes entirely, too caught up in the uncomfortable spectacle unfolding before them. The publicist was now openly conferring with security personnel at the side of the room. Throughout Walsh's increasingly provocative monologue, Clint Eastwood had remained still, his expression difficult to read. Those expecting an angry outburst, perhaps hoping for one, were left waiting. The filmmaker, who had built a career playing men of few words but decisive action, seemed to be taking his time. The tension in the room was palpable. Camera operators zoomed in on Eastwood's face, expecting, perhaps even hoping for, signs of anger or distress. Walsh remained standing, a picture of self-satisfaction, clearly believing he had cornered the legendary director. For a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, no one moved. The confrontation had reached its peak. What happened next would define the narrative that emerged from this press conference, and everyone in the room knew it. Finally, Eastwood leaned slightly forward toward his microphone. The simple movement commanded the complete attention of everyone present. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes never leaving Walsh's face. The entire room held its breath, waiting for his response. Clint Eastwood adjusted the microphone slightly, the soft screech drawing everyone's attention. His face remained composed, showing neither anger nor distress. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying the weight of decades of life experience. "You know," he began, his famous raspy tone somehow filling the room despite its softness. "In all my years in this business, I've learned that real dialogue happens when we listen more than we speak." He took a small sip of water, unhurried. The room remained completely silent. "I've been around long enough to see how quickly we can talk past each other when we're more interested in making our point than understanding someone else's." Walsh remained standing, but something in his posture had changed. The smug confidence was beginning to waver in the face of Eastwood's unexpected composure. "This film isn't about politics, though politics is the backdrop," Eastwood continued. "It's about what happens when we stop seeing the humanity in people we disagree with. When we start believing that those who see the world differently must be either stupid or evil." He gestured toward Walsh with an open hand. "Not accusatory, but inclusive. You've made some pretty strong statements about my views, my generation and my understanding of today's world," Eastwood said, "and you're entitled to those opinions. That's the beauty of the country we live in." Eastwood leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes never leaving Walsh's face. There was no hostility in his gaze, only a calm attentiveness. "You mentioned my age a couple times," he said with the hint of a smile. "You're right, I am old. 90-something years gives you a lot of perspective. I've seen this country go through civil rights struggles, Vietnam, Watergate, the Cold War, 9/11, and everything that's followed. I've seen times when it seemed like Americans couldn't possibly be more divided. And somehow we've always found our way back to each other." Several journalists were nodding slightly, captivated by the director's response. "The thing about growing older is you start to recognize patterns," Eastwood continued. "One of those patterns is how each generation thinks they've discovered something brand new about injustice or how to fix society. But the hard truth is that these struggles have been going on since the beginning of civilization." He shifted slightly in his chair, taking his time. "Now that doesn't mean we haven't made progress. We have. But it's been slow and messy, and it's happened because people found ways to communicate across their differences. Not because one side completely silenced the other." Walsh's expression had shifted from confrontational to something more complex, a mixture of frustration and unexpected intrigue. "You mentioned power imbalances," Eastwood acknowledged. "There's truth there. Some voices have historically been drowned out, and that's wrong. But the answer isn't to flip the script and drown out different voices. The answer is to create spaces where all perspectives can be heard and evaluated on their merits." The lead actress beside him was watching Eastwood with open admiration now. Even those in the room who disagreed with his politics seemed captivated by his approach. "I made this film because I've seen what happens when families, communities, and countries lose the ability to talk to each other. It's not pretty. And right now we're seeing that play out every day on the news and social media." Eastwood gestured toward the room at large. "Look at what just happened here. You came in with a set of assumptions about me, my views, and my film. Rather than asking genuine questions to understand, you delivered what amounted to a lecture, complete with quotes taken out of context. For the first time, Walsh looked slightly uncomfortable. "And that's your right," Eastwood continued. "But I have to wonder, what were you hoping would happen? Did you want me to get angry? To say something you could use as a headline? To confirm some idea you already have about who I am and what I believe?" A few journalists shifted in their seats, perhaps recognizing something of their own tactics in the question. "I've played tough guys most of my career," Eastwood said with a slight chuckle. "People expect me to respond to challenges with anger or force. But the older I get, the more I realize that listening is often the braver choice. It's easy to dismiss people we disagree with. It's harder to try to understand why they see the world the way they do." He leaned forward slightly, his voice growing a bit more intense, though still conversational. "This film isn't saying all viewpoints are equally valid, or that harmful ideas should go unchallenged. It's saying that when we immediately jump to the worst interpretation of someone else's views, when we assume malice rather than misunderstanding, we lose any chance of changing. Minds are finding common ground." Walsh had slowly begun to lower himself back into his seat, his theatrical confidence visibly diminished. "You mentioned my empty chair speech," Eastwood acknowledged with a self-deprecating smile. "Not my finest moment, I'll grant you that. I've made plenty of mistakes in my life, professionally and personally. And you know what? I've learned more from those mistakes than from my successes." Few people in the audience nodded in recognition of this universal truth. One thing age gives you is the freedom to admit when you've been wrong. Pride matters less when you realize how short life really is. He paused, taking another small sip of water. "You asked if my approach is moral cowardice," Eastwood said, addressing Walsh's earlier accusation directly. "I'd suggest it's the opposite. In today's world, it takes real courage to resist the pull toward tribalism, to remain open to the possibility that those we disagree with might occasionally have valid points, or at the very least understandable reasons for their beliefs." The publicist, who had been poised to intervene earlier, now stood relaxed at the side of the room, watching with evident relief as Eastwood handled the situation with unexpected grace. "Democracy gets messy," Eastwood continued. "It's supposed to. It's about balancing different interests and viewpoints. When we start believing that only one perspective deserves a voice, we're heading down a dangerous path, regardless of which perspective that is." He looked around the room, making brief eye contact with several journalists. "If you've seen the film, you know it doesn't suggest all viewpoints are equally valid. What it suggests is that we're all better off when we approach each other with genuine curiosity, rather than immediate judgment." Eastwood turned his attention back to Walsh, his expression thoughtful. The father in this film isn't portrayed as right about everything. Neither is the daughter. They're both portrayed as complex human beings trying to navigate a complicated world with the tools and understanding they have, just like all of us in this room. Walsh remained seated now, his notebook closed, his earlier bravado notably diminished. "You asked at what point hearing both sides becomes complicity with harmful ideas," Eastwood said. "That's actually a good question. There are lines. There are views so extreme and dangerous they don't deserve a platform. But those lines should be drawn very carefully, with tremendous humility. History is full of examples of silencing voices that later turned out to be right." He straightened slightly in his chair. "What I've found in 90-something years on this earth is that most people, not all, but most, are trying to do what they think is right based on their understanding of the world. That understanding may be limited or flawed, but dismissing them entirely only hardens positions and deepens division." Eastwood's gaze swept the room once more. "The film isn't suggesting we shouldn't fight for what we believe in. It's suggesting that how we fight matters, that remembering the humanity of those we disagree with makes us stronger, not weaker." He looked directly at Walsh again, his expression neither condescending nor angry, but genuinely engaged. "I appreciate passionate conviction. We need people who care deeply about the direction of our society, but conviction without compassion becomes something else entirely, something that tends to create more problems than it solves." Eastwood's final words hung in the air, the room completely silent as everyone absorbed what had just happened. What had begun as an ambush had transformed into something entirely unexpected, a masterclass in responding to provocation with dignity and wisdom. For several seconds after Eastwood finished speaking, the room remained completely silent. It was as if everyone present needed a moment to process what they had just witnessed. The tension that had filled the space minutes earlier had transformed into something entirely different, a collective pause for reflection. Walsh sat motionless, his earlier confidence replaced by an expression that was difficult to read. He looked like a man who had prepared for one kind of exchange and found himself in the middle of something entirely unexpected. His phone, which he had brandished so proudly while reciting out-of-context quotes, now lay forgotten on his lap. The veteran entertainment reporter who had earlier objected to Walsh's approach was the first to break the silence. He slowly began to applaud. The sound was jarring at first in the quiet room, but soon others joined in. Within moments, most of the journalists were applauding, not in the perfunctory way typical at press conferences, but with genuine appreciation. Eastwood looked slightly uncomfortable with this display, raising a hand in a gentle gesture asking them to stop. "We're just having a conversation here," he said with characteristic humility. "No need for all that." The festival moderator stepped forward, visibly relieved at how the situation had resolved itself. "We have time for just a few more questions about the film," he announced, emphasizing the last three words with deliberate care. Hands went up across the room, but the dynamic had shifted noticeably. The raised hands belonged mostly to journalists who had not yet had a chance to ask anything, rather than those seeking to follow up on the confrontation. A middle-aged film critic from an international publication was selected next. "Mr. Eastwood, you've always been known for efficient filmmaking, coming in under budget and ahead of schedule. Did that approach change at all for this more intimate, dialogue-driven project?" As Eastwood answered the question, discussing his preference for minimal takes and trusting actors to find their way naturally into scenes, several journalists were surreptitiously sending texts or emails on their phones. The confrontation and Eastwood's response were already making their way onto social media and news sites. Walsh remained in his seat, but his demeanor had changed completely. The theatrical confidence had vanished. He watched Eastwood with an expression that suggested he was seeing the filmmaker in a new light. Occasionally, he glanced down at his notebook, flipping through pages as if reconsidering the notes he had prepared so carefully. A culture reporter from a major newspaper caught Walsh's eye from across the room and raised an eyebrow in a silent question. Walsh gave a small shrug in response, then looked away. Near the back of the room, two young journalists were whispering to each other. "That was not what I expected," one said quietly. "Right? I thought he'd either blow up or give some standard non-answer," replied the other. "That was actually kind of profound. Makes me want to see the movie even more now." As the press conference continued, the questions returned to the craft of filmmaking, the challenges of the project, and the performances of the cast. Eastwood answered each with his typical straightforward style, occasionally deferring to the lead actress or producers when appropriate. Walsh did not ask another question. He sat quietly, occasionally making notes, his earlier desire to dominate the room apparently gone. Several times he seemed on the verge of raising his hand, only to lower it again after a moment's consideration. The publicist who had been prepared to remove Walsh earlier now watched him from the side of the room, her initial concern replaced by curiosity. She leaned over to whisper something to a colleague, both of them glancing at the journalist as they spoke. As the press conference neared its conclusion, a young reporter from an independent film website asked the final question. "Mr. Eastwood, your response earlier about listening and dialogue relates directly to the themes of your film. Was that intentional? Do you see your work as a filmmaker as an extension of your personal philosophy?" Eastwood considered this for a moment before responding. "I've never been one for separating the work from the person," he said. "Every film I make reflects something I believe or something I'm trying to understand better. This one may be more than most." He gestured to the room at large. "What happened here today, that's exactly what the film is about. How we talk to each other matters. How we listen matters even more. I hope people see the film and walk away asking themselves if they've really been hearing the people in their lives who see the world differently. That would be success in my book." With that thoughtful conclusion, the moderator thanked everyone for coming and announced the end of the press conference. As the room began to stir with the sounds of equipment being packed up and conversations resuming, many eyes remained on Eastwood and Walsh. The journalist sat for a moment longer, making a final note in his book. Then he stood and made his way toward the stage, moving against the flow of people who were heading for the exits. A few other reporters watched with interest, perhaps expecting another confrontation. When Walsh reached the edge of the stage, Eastwood was gathering his notes while chatting with the lead actress. Seeing the journalist approach, the publicist quickly stepped between them. "The press conference is over," she said firmly. "I just want a quick word," Walsh replied, his tone lacking the aggressive edge it had carried earlier. Eastwood looked up, noticed the exchange, and nodded to the publicist. "It's all right," he said. She stepped aside reluctantly, staying within earshot as Walsh approached. "Mr. Eastwood," the journalist began, his voice quiet enough that only those closest could hear. "I want to thank you for your response to my questions." Eastwood regarded him with mild surprise. "No need for thanks. That's what we're here for, to talk about ideas." "Still," Walsh continued, "most people would have either shut me down or fired back. I've been covering film and politics for 15 years, and that's usually how it goes." He hesitated, then added, "I came in with certain expectations about how this would play out. You didn't fit into that script." A slight smile crossed Eastwood's face. "Life rarely follows the script we write for it." Walsh nodded, seeming to wrestle with something internally. "My editor wanted controversy," he admitted. "Headlines drive traffic. Thoughtful dialogue, not so much." "And what do you want?" Eastwood asked simply. The question appeared to catch Walsh off guard. He considered it for several seconds before responding. "I used to want to change minds. Now I mostly want to confirm what I already believe." The admission carried the weight of unexpected self-awareness. Eastwood nodded in understanding. "Happens to the best of us." The lead actress, who had been listening to this exchange, spoke up. "Will you write about what happened here today?" Walsh looked at her, then back at Eastwood. "Yes," he said. "Though I'm not sure my editor will run what I actually write." "Write it anyway," Eastwood suggested. "Sometimes the stories we need to tell aren't the ones that get the most clicks." Around them, the room had mostly emptied. A few stragglers remained, some deliberately lingering to observe this unexpected epilogue to the confrontation. "I should let you go," Walsh said, extending his hand. "And I should probably see your film before writing about it." Eastwood shook the offered hand. "That would be a start." As Walsh turned to leave, Eastwood added, "You ask good questions, by the way. The wrong way, maybe, but good questions. This country needs people asking hard questions, just maybe with a bit more listening mixed in." The journalist nodded, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face. Without further comment, he made his way toward the exit, several curious colleagues falling into step beside him, already asking about what had been said. The publicist approached Eastwood as he gathered his things. "Well, that was unexpected," she said. "Are you all right?" Eastwood chuckled. "I've faced worse than tough questions in my day." "You handled it brilliantly," she replied. "I've already got calls coming in from major outlets wanting exclusive follow-ups." Eastwood shook his head. "No follow-ups. The film speaks for itself." As the small group made their way toward the side exit, avoiding the main lobby where more press would be waiting, the lead actress touched Eastwood's arm. "What you said in there," she began. "About listening and trying to understand different perspectives, I've never heard it put quite that way before." Eastwood shrugged slightly. "Nothing profound about it. Just something you learn if you live long enough." "Still," she insisted, "it made me think about some conversations I've been avoiding with my own family." Eastwood nodded in understanding. That's all any film can hope to do, make people think a little differently about their own lives. As they stepped out into the late afternoon sun, a few photographers spotted them and began taking pictures, but the usual barrage of shouted questions didn't follow. Instead, there was an unusual quiet, as if news of what had transpired inside had already spread. The confrontation that had begun as an attempt to provoke and embarrass had transformed into something entirely unexpected, a moment of genuine connection and reflection that had touched everyone in that room in ways they couldn't have anticipated. By the following morning, video clips of the exchange between Eastwood and Walsh had spread across every major social media platform. What began as a confrontation at a film festival press conference had transformed into something much larger, a moment that seemed to capture the zeitgeist of a divided nation. Watch Clint Eastwood's Masterclass in Responding to Criticism, read one headline. How a 90-something director just schooled us all on civil discourse, proclaimed another. Breakfast television shows played abbreviated clips, followed by panels discussing the implications of what had transpired. Radio hosts invited callers to share their reactions. Comment sections filled with thousands of responses, many expressing surprise at finding themselves agreeing with someone they had long considered a political opponent. In his hotel room, Peter Walsh sat at the desk staring at his laptop screen. He had been writing and rewriting his article for hours, struggling to capture what had really happened. The draft he'd initially sent to his editor at the Progressive Voice had been returned with a terse note. "This isn't what we discussed. We need something harder hitting about Eastwood's outdated views. Rewrite." Walsh poured himself another cup of coffee and scrolled through his social media feeds. His colleagues from other publications had already published their takes on the exchange. Most portrayed him as having been outmaneuvered by Eastwood, though a few progressive outlets praised him for challenging privilege and speaking truth to power. His phone buzzed with a text from his editor. "Where's the rewrite?" Deadline was an hour ago. Walsh sighed and closed the message without responding. He opened a new document and began typing again, this time not for his publication but for himself. The words flowed more easily now. "I went to the Westwood Film Festival with a plan. I had prepared my questions, or more accurately, my accusations, carefully. I had selected quotes, removed context, and crafted what I believed would be a confrontation that would generate headlines and traffic for my publication. I expected anger, defensiveness, or perhaps a dismissive non-answer from a Hollywood legend past his prime. What I received instead was something I hadn't encountered in my 15 years of journalism. Someone who actually listened before responding, someone who treated even hostile questions as an opportunity for genuine dialogue rather than combat. I'm not writing to say I've changed all my political views overnight. I haven't. But I am writing to acknowledge that something in my approach to discourse has been fundamentally flawed. I've been having arguments, not conversations." He continued writing for nearly an hour, producing the most honest piece of his career. When he finished, he read it over once more, then sent it not to his regular editor but to the publication's founder, a veteran journalist who had started the outlet with loftier goals than click rates. Across town, in a significantly more upscale hotel suite, Eastwood was conducting a scheduled interview with a respected film critic from a national newspaper. The critic, a thoughtful woman in her 50s who had covered cinema for decades, couldn't help but address what had happened. "I have to ask about yesterday's press conference," she said. "That exchange has become something of a cultural moment." Eastwood waved a hand dismissively. "Blown out of proportion?" "I don't think so," she countered gently. "In a time when most public disagreements devolve into shouting matches or Twitter wars, what happened yesterday felt different, important even." Eastwood considered this. "If people found something useful in it, that's good, I suppose. But I wasn't trying to make a statement, just having a conversation. That might be precisely why it resonated," she suggested. "It wasn't performative. Most public figures respond to criticism either by attacking back or with carefully crafted PR statements. You did neither. Too old to worry much about PR," Eastwood said with a slight smile. "And attacking someone doesn't accomplish much." "Your film opens nationwide next week," the critic continued. "Do you think yesterday's exchange will impact how audiences receive it?" "Hope not," Eastwood replied. "Film should stand on its own. But if it gets more people talking about how we talk to each other, I won't complain." Meanwhile, in newsrooms and living rooms across the country, the conversation continued to expand. Political commentators who rarely agreed on anything found themselves united in analyzing the exchange. While they drew different conclusions about who won, many acknowledged that the level of discourse itself had been unusually elevated. A popular late-night host opened his monologue by saying, "Something weird happened yesterday. A public disagreement about politics didn't end with someone being destroyed, canceled, or turning into a meme. I know I'm as confused as you are." On a major news network's roundtable show, a conservative pundit remarked, "Whether you agree with Eastwood's politics or not, his approach to criticism should be a model for all of us." To which a progressive counterpart surprisingly added, "I find myself agreeing. We've created a culture where the goal is to demolish opponents, not to understand them. That might win battles but lose wars." 3 days after the press conference, the Progressive Voice published Peter Walsh's piece under the headline, How Clint Eastwood Changed My Mind About Dialogue. The honest, self-reflective article struck a chord, quickly becoming the most read piece in the publication's history. Walsh wrote candidly about his intentions going into the press conference and how Eastwood's response had forced him to reconsider his approach to journalism. "I've built a career on what I thought was speaking truth to power," he wrote. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped being interested in truth and became obsessed with power. The power to shape narratives, to elevate some voices and silence others, to be the arbiter of which perspectives deserve respect." Eastwood didn't try to silence me. He didn't dismiss my concerns or attack me personally. Instead, he listened, acknowledged the legitimate aspects of my criticism, and gently suggested a different approach. In doing so, he showed more respect for my perspective than I had shown for his. The article concluded, "I still believe deeply in the causes I've always championed. I still believe some views deserve vigorous challenge. But I'm beginning to wonder if our approach has been counterproductive. If we want to change minds rather than simply reinforce the views of those who already agree with us, perhaps we need to reconsider how we engage with those we oppose." Perhaps, as Eastwood suggested, real dialogue begins with listening. Journalism schools across the country incorporated the exchange into their ethics curricula. Communication professors assigned both the video and Walsh's subsequent article as required study materials. A renowned conflict resolution expert called it a perfect case study in de-escalation and bridge building. When Eastwood's film premiered the following week, it drew larger audiences than initially projected. Critics noted that while the film had artistic merits of its own, the press conference exchange had created a context that made its themes of dialogue across differences particularly resonant. In one notable review, a prominent critic wrote, "Rarely does life imitate art so perfectly." In his press conference response to a hostile critic, Eastwood embodied exactly the kind of thoughtful engagement across ideological divides that his film portrays. Both offer a welcome alternative to the scorched earth approach that dominates our current discourse. 6 months later, Peter Walsh published a book titled Listening Across the Divide, chronicling his journey from confrontational advocate to proponent of more constructive dialogue. In the acknowledgments, he wrote simply, "To Clint Eastwood, who taught me more in 5 minutes than I learned in 15 years of journalism school." The book's cover featured a quote from Eastwood, "Real dialogue happens when we listen more than we speak." The legendary filmmaker never spoke publicly about the incident again, preferring to let his work and that single moment of genuine human connection speak for themselves. When asked about it in subsequent interviews, he would simply redirect the conversation to whatever project he was currently focused on. But something had shifted, however slightly, in the culture. References to pulling an Eastwood became shorthand for responding to hostility with dignity and thoughtful engagement, rather than defensive anger. In a world increasingly defined by division and conflict, that brief exchange, a confrontation transformed into a conversation, offered a glimpse of another possibility. That even in our most heated disagreements, we might still find ways to recognize each other's humanity and perhaps, just perhaps, learn something in the process.